Thank you, Joe.
Okay.
Thank you, Katina and MG Michael, and thank you to the wonderful Joseph Carvalko and the Yale Interdisciplinary Centre for Bioethics for hosting us today. Thank you. Next slide, Katina. Before providing a commentary on the evolution of Überveillance as a definition, so I'm going to backtrack a bit back to where we started with MG Michael. I'll commence this critique by referring to or referencing a taxonomy and comparison of the different forms of veillance to really situate this critique. And these forms of veillance were articulated so well by MG Michael in his introductory remarks, and they've been documented well in various publications, such as the article that you see on your screen, and I think this is a helpful starting point in the critique. So this article represents the evolution of the different gazes that are expressed in the literature. That is that shift that MG Michael mentioned from the above, surveillance, to the below, which is surveillance, and then the within, Überveillance, and really provides the foundations for our taxonomy and a critique, whereby Überveillance can be perceived as the merging of all of these gazes. On the next slide, you can see that specifically we'll be drawing here on the work from 2012, in which Überveillance was by this time an established term situated alongside other forms of veillance, as Katina mentioned in her historical account and journey around the term. So notably, we're looking at surveillance, dataveillance, and surveillance. So the comparison that is provided on this slide was in the context of a study around the socio, so the social subsystem, as it's referred to, which is derived from a socio-technical theorization, whereby the different types of veillance and monitoring systems were explored in terms of their implications, specifically on the theme of control, as mentioned by MG Michael as an underlying factor in his introductory remarks. So the table presented here compares the different features of surveillance, dataveillance, surveillance, and Überveillance, as summarized in 2012 in my doctoral thesis, which was centered on determining the need for location-based services regulation, and also in a subsequent article published with MG Michael and Katina Michael that's referenced on the slide in the International Review of Information Ethics. So I'll briefly spend a moment on summarizing and comparing each of these concepts, pointing to the important distinctions as we move towards the definition and main characteristics of Überveillance as represented in the literature. So I'll be reiterating some of the points covered by MG and Katina, but really emphasizing the main elements and characteristics from a comparative perspective. So surveillance is concerned with the process of methodically monitoring through various means and based on the collection of information about behaviours, actions, and so on that are related to an individual or individuals. And it's important to point that this tends to be a targeted and routine process or action in nature, utilising primarily visual monitoring systems with an emphasis on first-hand observation and images. And a distinction has been made in the literature by Professor Roger Clark, between the personal and mass surveillance practices. In surveillance studies, a range of metaphors have been utilised to explore and understand surveillance, and a prevalent metaphor is that of the panopticon, which was first introduced by Bentham in 1843 and later by Foucault in 1977. So if we move to this somewhat superseding notion of data surveillance, which, as MG Michael mentioned, is commonly referred to as dataveillance. This term was coined in the mid-80s, and it extends the notion of surveillance to focus on the organised and regular use of, as MG mentioned, personal data systems for monitoring purposes based on an automated process or processes in which data trails of individuals are collected. The emphasis here is on data or aggregated data and information, as opposed to your traditional forms of surveillance that comparatively rely on extensive or expensive visual monitoring techniques. Next, we have the term surveillance, which was coined by Steve Mann and originates from the French term sous, which means from below, and when combined with Veillan, denotes to watch from below. So as MG Michael mentioned, Steve Mann refers to this as somewhat of inverse surveillance or surveilling the surveillors. This type of veillance makes use of wearable computing devices and technologies to capture audio, visual, and sensory data, and may include images of locations and corresponding geographic coordinates. And lastly, in terms of situating this critique, we have Überveillance, which combines the dimensions of identification, location, and time, potentially allowing for forecasting and uninterrupted real-time monitoring, which was documented by Katina and MG Michael in 2007. So in the earlier definitions that MG Michael and Katina have utilized, this has been likened to Big Brother on the inside looking out. And at the time of the publications that are cited on this screen below the table, Überveillance was considered by several authors to be that contemporary notion that would supplant surveillance as a term, primarily through the extension of the notion of data veillance. So on the next slide, we can look to recent literature that's taken the initial taxonomy and built on this taxonomy and provided further extensions. But without elaborating too much here, I think I'll shift to the critique of the evolution of the concept itself from when it was originally coined to the present day. So on the next screen, thank you, Katina. Let's revisit MG Michael's original definition. Sorry, Katina, the next screen, please. MG Michael's original definition, as was stated earlier, is an above and beyond omnipresent 24 surveillance where the explicit concerns for misinformation, misrepresentation, and information manipulation are ever more multiplied, and where potentially the technology is embedded within our body. In this definition, I'd like to point to the amplified levels of surveillance that are continuous in nature by that 24/7 reference, and also the embedded element, which features in this early definition. So soon after this definition in 2007, Roger Clark was invited to give a keynote presentation in those pictures that Katina showed earlier, in which he provided 3 interpretations of Überveillance. The first one was around an exaggerated form of surveillance, which is really about the increase of the scope and extent of surveillance, considering concepts such as the how, where, and what dimensions and extensions to their scope. The second interpretation was around master surveillance, which really underscores the Uber prefix to imply the meta, supra, or master surveillance aspect, and a view of surveillance whereby multiple sources are utilized in the provision of somewhat of a holistic, in inverted commas, picture comprised of superior or made up of superior information collection capabilities. And Roger Clark's last interpretation was around this notion of omni-surveillance, which is really that apocalyptic view that MG Michael referred to, and that dystopian perspective that highlighting all aspects of surveillance across, or the all aspect, of surveillance, so across all space, all time, and the all-seeing and all-knowing elements. Now, if we move to the next slide, to an evolution of these earlier definitions and interpretations in the literature, we can demonstrate in this evolution a shift from focus on purely embedded technologies to the consistent, persistent, and pervasive aspects and characteristics. So the implications of Überveillance on civil liberties stressed in the work of Palmer and colleagues, and elements of that inescapable gaze are discussed and emphasized. Another, evolution on the next slide, we witness yet another progression in the definition of Überveillance, this time moving beyond a human-centric view to the non-human, so to things such as animals, to products, to transactions, and to our value and supply chains. And I think it's really important at this point to draw out and point to an aspect that MG Michael spoke about in his talk earlier about the elasticity of the term. So the term is quite malleable, and as a result may be applied in both a narrow or from a narrow perspective and also in a broad sense. Narrow really signifying only the embedded devices in a human's view, and the broad sense signaling a shift in terms of encompassing the non-human entities that I mentioned, so animals, products, transactions, and so on. And I think a new form of veillance is signaled in this respect. It is reliant on multiple sources rather than just the embedded devices, multiple sources, and a somewhat amplified form of surveillance and data veillance also. So this elasticity also means that Überveillance can be applied across a range of application areas. But before I briefly discuss the application areas, I'll be as brief as possible to leave some time for some questions. Let's review a number of prominent references that I think are important in terms of this critique. On the next slide, the first reference points to the invited keynote delivered by Professor Roger Clark, in which I spoke about the interpretations. And this was delivered at the second RNSA workshop on the social implications of national security in 2006, and was later revised for publication in the IEEE Technology and Society magazine in 2010. In this particular reference, Clark articulates a range of interpretations, as mentioned, including that evolution aspect and those three perspectives, so the exaggerated, the master, and the omni-surveillance. And he continues to pose a range of counterveillance principles in response to the potential perils relating to the various interpretations of Überveillance and indeed surveillance. These include, but are not limited to, which I think still hold true today, the significance of independent evaluation of emerging technologies, consultation and participation, which is quite a dominant theme at the moment in terms of co-design and participatory approaches, and also the selection of a suitable design or suitable design principles when considering this notion of Überveillance. And these counterveillance measures certainly apply today. On the next slide, and in this second reference to Überveillance that was chosen to highlight here, the concept is discussed from a philosophical perspective by Professor Rafael Capurro in the context of Society 5.0. So Society 5.0 really moves beyond the Society 1.0 focus on the hunter-gatherer approach, beyond Society 2.0, which emphasizes agriculture, Society 3.0, which is characterized by industrialization, and Society 4.0, which is around information in the information age, to promoting a human-centered, super smart Society 5.0. So this society really symbolizes a complex cyber-physical ecosystem that supersedes the fourth industrial revolution even, and as such is predicted to be more transformative in nature. In terms of Professor Capurro's work, the link to Überveillance is somewhat cautionary in that it promotes questioning of computer power as we approach this Society 5.0 in order to avoid becoming an Überveillance society and to avoid some of those consequences that Katina and MG alluded to in their talks. The third reference, or this next fourth, is a report produced by the NSI team for the US Department of Homeland Security and for the Department of Defense, in which the security and defense related challenges stemming from emerging and disruptive technologies are considered. So there's a call for critical and disruptive thinking to explore the role, potential, and the perils or challenges of technological advancements from a government perspective, providing guidance to stakeholders such as intelligence agencies, law enforcement personnel, the military and policy agencies. And Überveillance is referenced in this particular report with respect to cybersecurity and hacking, notably the planetary scale RFID services in an Age of Überveillance article that was published by Katina and a number of colleagues in 2010. And this final reference that we're highlighting here is by the Netherlands government, centered on data and digital technology in public spaces and the related issues of data ownership, control and social values. So Überveillance is addressed in this report from an ethical viewpoint, in which the authors propose, again, a participatory design approach to counter some of these identified challenges, or the identified challenges, which relate really to a government-based view of Überveillance, whereby a range of monitoring techniques or monitoring sources are employed in public spaces, potentially resulting in misinformation, misrepresentation, and manipulation as per earlier definitions of Überveillance. And the report furthermore highlights the value that Dutch citizens place on privacy. So that includes information privacy, social communicative privacy, psychological privacy, and informational privacy. And just one element that I think I'll point out here is the claim that's made that in an Überveillance society, privacy will be compromised at various levels, considering those different types of privacy that I just identified. And I'll probably, just to leave some time for question, end with this slide and not emphasize too much the points, but with these range of demonstrative and prominent references, just to summarize, it's clear that Überveillance has morphed as a concept and can be applied in a variety and a range of situations and contexts. and in different ways. Some examples include in forensics, in nursing, sports, in government, healthcare, and much, much more, such as architecture, for instance, and other areas, which I can't delve too deeply into just in the interest of time here. So as the use of this term intensifies, discussions around information access will become increasingly important. And this is represented by the concept of access defined by M.G. Michael, which Katina will hopefully be able to describe in the concluding remarks here. Thank you, Katina, over to you.